Welcome to the Armenian News Network Groong Week in Review for July 14, 2024. Today we're talking with Hrant Mikaelian. Hello, Hrant. Welcome to the show.
Ողջույն, Hrant.
Hello, guys. Thank you for having me.
Always great to have you on the show.
Hrant, let's begin with a topic that I feel we cannot ignore this week. The entire world is talking about the assassination attempt on Donald Trump that occurred on July 13, 2024 in Butler, Pennsylvania. Now, there are many questions to ask about this incident, and probably our show is not the best place to talk about the apparent failure of U.S. Secret Service to adequately protect the former president and the current Republican presidential candidate. But for many of those in the region, including ourselves, the question is about what happens next, especially since it seems that the prospect of a Trump presidency is now much higher when you look at some of the measurements coming after the assassination attempt. So would you be able to maybe give us some predictions, in your opinion, what would happen in the case of a Trump presidency and if the power switches from Democrats to Republicans in November?
From what we can see, Trump presidency this time will be a bit different from what we could observe between 2017 and 2020. Basically, now Trump will be more into realizing his program, and he has many plans, lots of stuff to get employed. And this time, I think the policy in the South Caucasus will be changed, which did not happen in 2017. In 2017, when the administration changed, nothing in U.S. policy changed towards Caucasus. This time, the change will happen. Now, which kind of change it might be? First of all, the American policy most likely will be switching from Eastern Europe towards Eastern Asia. And Trump has made it clear that he and most of his supporters want this change to happen. And I think this is one thing, and there will be much less competition between Russia and the United States in the South Caucasus, although these policies might start being realized since mid-2025. It will not happen immediately, but at least this is the first thing which we should expect. Another thing is that this might bring an end to hot stage of Ukraine conflict, which is also important, and it will affect Armenia's both geopolitical position and the economic situation in Armenia. Another thing is that there might be a bit different relations with Turkey, but many things are yet to see. So the last thing which obviously be changing is US policy towards Israel. On one hand, Trump is more supportive of Israel. On another hand, Trump will be seeking for solution with Israel-Gaza conflict. I don't think he will be interested in continuation of this conflict. And by the way, there is a big if. If Trump will behave the same way as he did before towards Iran, then Iran-US rapprochement is not an option. So with Iran, I don't think we should have big hopes because Israeli lobby in Trump administration is very strong. And that's why there will be most probably difficult relations between Iran and United States, although current Iranian president will seek for rapprochement. So this is also one direction to track.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned Israel and Gaza and the fact that by all accounts, it seems that Trump supports Israel more unconditionally, it seems. Doesn't that lead to more risk of war with Iran? And in that case, wouldn't South Caucasus be the battleground for that?
In my opinion, Trump will support Israel publicly, will support Israel by funding it. He might support Israeli current government, which we know there is a difference between different approaches between Biden and Trump, because Trump could support Netanyahu while Biden would prefer see Netanyahu leaving. Although I'm not sure Trump will be ready to get physically and directly involved into regional affairs this time in Iran and Israel, because I think today most of American political class realizes that American interventions in Middle East turn out badly, usually, and Iran will definitely be much worse than Iraq, which also turned to be a mess. So I think Trump will still try to avoid interfering directly, because from what we can see is that his political platform is isolationism. towards European and Eurasian affairs, as well as Middle East. So this is my expectation, although I might be wrong.
Let's talk a little bit about Mirzoyan at the NATO summit about a weekend ago. Foreign ministers Mirzoyan and Bayramov were invited to attend the NATO summit in Washington, D.C. over the weekend of July 8th. It's clear that the U.S. has been putting a lot of attention, if not outright pressure, on Armenia and Azerbaijan to sign an agreement, any agreement. Despite Blinken proclaiming that the sides are close to signing an historic agreement, Aliyev has effectively stopped the process with his demand that Armenia change its constitution. And while Azerbaijan says that this is the main sticking point in the negotiations, it's clear that Aliyev is saying that this is only the current sticking point. They've explicitly said that changing Armenian constitution doesn't mean that they're going to sign anything. Hrant, what do you think were the outcomes from Mirzoyan's trip to Washington, D.C., and how would you assess the current state of any kind of talks between Armenia and Azerbaijan?
Basically, we have heard optimism from American politicians very many times. I can remember Matthew Bryzer, who was American co-chair in Minsk Group, who was very optimistic in 2007 and 2008. He was telling the public, like every other week, that there are just a couple of words remaining to sign a final agreement, and we see where we are now. So I think this is more or less the same approach. So they are trying to create an optimistic background, optimistic, let's say, approach. But the thing is that if the sides do not have strategic interests in signing such an agreement, then this agreement will not be signed. And definitely I'm talking about Azerbaijan here, and only Azerbaijan, by the way. But there is another thing, which is not so much about Azerbaijan, but much more about Turkey. So if you have negotiations where the two sides are present, and then there is a third invisible side, which is the main side who affects the outcomes of these negotiations, which is Turkey again, then you cannot have an agreement. By the way, the very same way as you cannot have an agreement between Russia and Ukraine if US is not sitting around the table.
Hrant, can you elaborate on that in terms of what exactly is Turkey's agenda in these discussions? Is it 100%, essentially, is Azerbaijan pursuing 100% Turkey's agenda? And where are the essentially differences between what Aliyev wants and what Erdogan wants?
In my view, and from what I know, Aliyev is not sovereign in terms of foreign politics, and he completely supports and works in line with Turkish foreign policy. And by the way, it's not only about current president of Azerbaijan, but the former president of Azerbaijan, Heydar Aliyev, who is father of Ilham Aliyev. He was also in line with Turkish policies. And there were several agreements which have failed just because of Turkish intervention, including, for example, 99 Key West agreements and so on. So Turkey does not want to have these agreements done because Turkey wants to have conflict in South Caucasus, because through this conflict, Turkey gets involved in South Caucasus affairs. Of course, on side of Azerbaijan, but the more it gets involved, the more it affects Armenia as well. So now they want to go to Caspian, and the thing is that for that they need so-called Zangezur corridor, which is Turkish agenda, but Azerbaijan is pursuing this agenda as well. So in my view, if there was no invisible Turkey around the negotiation table, then the agreement would be possible. But since there is, and there always will be, Turkey, and it cannot be excluded, then the agreement is impossible, completely impossible. That's my view. And Turkey has not reversed its policies towards Armenia, neither in last 30 years, nor in, let's say, last 100 years, and so on. So I don't see this change happening in any time in political perspective.
As a matter of fact, coming out of the NATO summit, I think Erdogan mentioned that the final step was going to be for Armenia to give up Syunik. He didn't say those words, but basically, as you mentioned, Turkey and Azerbaijan want that extraterritorial corridor to connect through Armenia. He, by the way, frequently reminds Pashinyan of this. Like, for example, this past week, Turkey simply blocked cargo air traffic to Armenia with no warning or reason. And, that's a nice little reminder. So if Aliyev's constitutional changes are not the final requirement. What can we expect on the road to a final so-called peace treaty or an agreement in principle or a framework agreement?
First of all, I want to elaborate on the cancelling the passage right through Turkish airspace for Armenian cargo companies. This is very important step, which shows that even if the border is opened, even if so, then Turkey will still be able to close it at any day for any reason and even without any reason. So that's first and very important, because this means that any concession Turkey gains or gets for opening the border is just a waste of resources and a poor negotiation position on Armenian side. Armenia should not concede anything for this border opening. Of course, it already has done a lot, but this should be a principal position. Turkey has closed the border, Turkey should open it without any conditions and even more.
Yeah.
But anyway, coming back to negotiations.
Sometimes this gets lost on people that it is Turkey that has unilaterally closed the border with Armenia, which is equivalent to an act of war. And the reason why it closed the border was because of Armenian advances in Karabakh, I believe, during the First War. So those reasons no longer exist, but the border still remains closed. And I think that also supports your argument. And many times listeners forget that it is actually not a mutual closing of the border. Armenia would be happy to open the border without any preconditions, but it is Turkey that has unilaterally kept the border closed all these years.
Border is open on Armenian side. So basically, Turkey has closed it. And by the way, yes, they say they closed it because Armenians took Karabakh. But in reality, Turkey has never opened it. Because since Armenia's independence in 1991, Turkish-Armenian border has worked 4 or 5 times, each of which was connected to passage of humanitarian aid, which was forced by United States. Outside of that, this border has never worked. So this is very important to understand. Another question was regarding the agreement with Azerbaijan. So I would like to make a short note on that. If someone wants to have an agreement very much, but another side does not want, this means that there will be no agreement. For, of course, many would like, especially many outside of our region, many in Brussels, many in Washington, and many in Moscow would like to listen me saying that we need to do this and that, and then there will be an agreement. What I can say is that we cannot do anything to get this agreement. The only thing we can get is the effective military deterrence to prevent this conflict from happening for as long as possible until something happens which will not let this conflict to go on. Look at the Middle East and Israeli-Arab conflict. Why it's never ending? Well, just because. And if you are trying to make an approach like, there is France and Germany, they have been fighting each other for hundreds of years, and now they are good friends and so on. This is not applicable to the South Caucasus. Anyone saying the opposite does not understand anything about this region. That's what I can say.
Hrant, a little bit earlier, you mentioned that a Trump presidency could mean the end of Ukraine's hot war. In that context, do you feel a sense of urgency on the part of the U.S. to get an agreement signed, like the invitations to NATO summit, etc.? What's in it for the U.S. in such an agreement? And also, what kind of leverage does the U.S. have on Azerbaijan and Turkey to achieve an agreement? It's obvious that it's not Armenia that is not signing. So how can the U.S. pressure Azerbaijan and Turkey to sign something, whatever it is?
The problem is that, yes, Armenia is always ready to sign an agreement, which, by the way, not only Pashinyan, but his predecessors were stating all the time. Now, Azerbaijan does not want to sign an agreement. And the question here is that if Azerbaijan does not want and makes the list of preconditions, so then there is a temptation to say that, okay, if Armenia fulfills Azerbaijani preconditions, then there will be an agreement. Unfortunately, this has been a framework of negotiations since the very beginning, since 1992. American negotiators were always stating that you need to make concessions, both sides need to make concessions in order to get an agreement. But if you look at which concessions have been expected on Armenian side and which had been expected on Azerbaijani side, basically you see that it's only Armenian side which should have made concessions. And the same situation is now. So a couple of days ago, American officials started saying again that both sides need to make concessions. But again, I don't see any concessions which Azerbaijan needs to make. So I don't see a viable options towards peace in any foreseeable future. So I think the better we realize, especially the mediators, and especially in the capitals like Brussels, Moscow, and Washington, the better it will be. Because in reality, there is virtually no option of signing a viable agreement.
If the US really wanted, would they be able to apply any pressure on Azerbaijan? So, if we said that the US should talk the talk instead of, since it's walking the walk, what are some examples of pressures that realistically the US could apply that would change Azerbaijan's position? Or is it simply not feasible, in your opinion?
Well, they say US could sanction Azerbaijan, or US could affect somehow the assets of Azerbaijani ruling elite, and so on. I don't see this happening for several reasons. First of all, for United States, Armenia is not as important as, for example, Ukraine. And by the way, Turkey is their ally. So even if they don't like how Azerbaijan and Turkey behave, well, which we might say they don't like their behavior, but still they have some, strategic partnership, which they will not cancel by just sanctioning Azerbaijan. Another thing is that since Iran is a, let's say, peer competitor of the West in the Middle East, or even an enemy of United States in the Middle East, Azerbaijan will be important, because Azerbaijan is an important country to deter Iran in case of conflict. So Azerbaijan has always played this card of, Iranian threat. And then Azerbaijan is also important as a country in between Russia and Iran. Moreover, Azerbaijan has very big geographic advantage over Armenia because it has connection to Caspian Sea. And then you can have alternative route, alternative to Russia and to, let's say, Arabian countries, through Azerbaijan, Georgia, Sea, and then directly to Europe, or Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Turkey to Europe again. So this might be a corridor of Central Asian energy resources. So for all these reasons, Azerbaijan is important for US elite. And then you can add up some, lobbying and so on, but strategic considerations are more important in my view. So I don't see how United States will use their leverage towards Azerbaijan, at least now. And even if the leverage is used, it does not mean that Azerbaijan will immediately change its policies, because we can see many countries sanctioned by the West lately. And yes, it somehow affects their policies, but it does not change them completely. And in Azerbaijani press, I have read some articles, and by the way, articles by the editors of the newspapers, not just by anonymous authors and so on, where they have been discussing the possibilities of sanctions. For example, if Azerbaijan captures the whole Sunni region of Armenia, they were discussing which kind of sanctions they might get and discussing how they will be overcoming the sanctions. So they are ready even for sanctions. So I don't see how United States can leverage towards Azerbaijan with today's configuration, let's say.
And we also saw last week, as Pashinyan attended, Aliyev also attended, but as Pashinyan attended the NATO summit, Russia apparently was pretty angry, and Deputy Foreign Minister of Russia, Galuzin, said that, and I'm quoting, "By deepening cooperation at such a pace with those whose goal is the strategic defeat of Russia, Yerevan risks seriously destabilizing the situation in the South Caucasus to the detriment, including its own security." And despite how this downward tumble in Armenian and Russian relations started, we have what we have, which is Armenia's strategic ally, for whatever reason, was not able to stop the ethnic cleansing of Artsakh and the continuing pressure by Armenia's mortal enemies to give up more territory. So regardless of the reasons, that fact stands out on its own. So my question is, what does Russia expect when it has made concessions to Turkey and Azerbaijan to the detriment of Armenia?
Well, on one hand, of course, we have problematic policies of Russia in this region. So Russia's policies are egoistic and full of just pure trade and not pro-Armenian, to say the least. On another hand, we need to consider one important consideration, which is that Russia is not going anywhere. So even if we dislike Russian policies towards Armenia, towards Artsakh, or even towards Ukraine, this does not mean that we can ignore Russian factor in this region. So, like it or not, we need to put into account Russia's considerations. Now, how we deal with it, it's another question. But putting it into equation of our foreign policies is important. Let's put aside the issue of strategic ally. I think there is no alliance between Armenia and Russia anymore. And let's say, at least since 2019, effectively, this alliance has gone. But at the same time, Russia might turn into enemy of Armenia. And Galuzin basically says that Russia might turn an enemy, especially after Ukraine war ends. Armenia might be on top of the list of countries to which Russia is going to, let's say, counteract or, strike back, let's say. So this needs to be addressed adequately. And I don't see, by the way, how Armenian government is considering these risks. Maybe they realize this risk, but I don't see them having any proper discussion on what we're going to do next. It's not only about what Russia should have done and did not do, or to which extent Russia was Armenia's ally in the events of Artsakh and in some other cases. But it's also about how Russia could turn into Armenia's enemy with these policies. And I obviously see this happening as well.
Right.
Hovik, let's just take a moment here. We'd like to remind everyone to go to our donate page, podcasts.groong.org/donate, and consider buying us a coffee, or better yet, become a sustaining member of Groong and give monthly.
We like to believe that we are unique in the category of Armenian podcasts. We digest Armenian news weekly and bring you interesting discussions relevant to it. We've always been a labor of love, and we're not only nonprofit, but we're also non-budget. Just 2 to 3 friends who have committed our lives, time, and effort to understand the world around Armenians and sharing that understanding with you.
Of course, we will continue our work as we always have, but we are stronger with you than without you. Your support will help us expand our reach to more people who are interested in Armenian news and affairs around the world.
So please visit our donate page, podcasts.groong.org/donate, and consider supporting us. Thank you in advance. We appreciate your listening to us and take that trust and your support very seriously.
Well, summer is the season of tourism. And over the course of this summer, there's been a flood of U.S. officials running through Armenia. Last week, it was Samantha Power, director of U.S. aid, baking Jingalov huts with Artsakh refugees in Armenia and promising $2.5 million towards protecting Armenian citizens' private data, and also $5 million to expand the use of AWS in Armenia.
Well, for more details about privacy and security in general and the ability of the Armenian regime, the current regime and successive governments before it to safeguard Armenian citizens' data, I should refer you to the previous podcast that we recorded with Ruben Muradian and Artur Papian.
Episode 344.
Report 344. Yeah, so just let's put it on the record that we are very skeptical about anything related to increased use of cloud and privacy. So I don't know what this press release is about, to be honest. Honest.
Anyway, there have been a flood of officials. I'm just picking on Samantha Power because she is special to Armenians. Meanwhile, Ambassador Kvin was in Sunik celebrating the U.S. Day of Independence in Kapan. She appears to enjoy Sunik as much as Lynn Tracy, her predecessor. So, Hrant, are we special, or is the U.S. spending just as much time around Georgia and Azerbaijan as well?
Asbed, let's not forget that the currently Deputy Secretary of State Uzra Zeya is in Yerevan, meeting with civil society leaders and visiting Tsitsernakaberd and other places.
Yes.
So
yes,
it is a pretty big parade.
Hrant, what do you think about this?
Well, first of all, I want to say that I doubt any other country being afraid of, Armenian users losing their data or data transparency in Armenia or data protection, and especially United States, who have been, spying over the data of users all over the world. So, so in my view, this is a bit worrying direction of cooperation with foreign countries over the data privacies of Armenian users. This is first. Second, the head of Armenian Foreign Intelligence Service, Christina Grigoryan, who is meeting American officials and discussing something, having some negotiations for I don't know what reason and so on. This is again worrying because usually heads of intelligence services are not transparent persons, especially in contacts with foreign partners. So what is the matter of these contacts for me is unclear. Then United States are funding, it's today's news, are funding $16 million for creation of patrol service of Armenian police. And also,
so the
there is
patrol
another
service
news.
was already so Hrant, the patrol service was already created. So is this continuing the existing funding that they already have?
Well, at least they're creating some new institutional treats there. I don't know exactly how these funds are going to be spent, but it's an investment in institution building in Armenia. And then again, it's today's news that there will be Pentagon representative in Armenian Ministry of Defense. And then another thing, a couple of days ago, Armenian-American military exercises have started, the very same exercises which have been canceled in Georgia. So basically, we see Americans getting involved in cooperation with Armenian Secret Service or Foreign Intelligence Service, let's say, then the police, then Ministry of Defense, and other services like this. So, and then the data protection and so on. And in this case, I think these relations are not going to be equal. So I see this as a problem, to be frank, because if there is an institutional cooperation to this extent where Americans are teaching Armenians to create or to reform the institutions, this means that Americans will have, most likely, they will have control over these institutions, or at least some extent of control, the same way as they did in Ukraine, for example. And this is not increasing Armenia's sovereignty at all. I think this is an opposite direction. So I think this needs to be tracked and tracked adequately, because this extent of institutional involvement of United States in Armenia, I mean, these funds are not that big, but the directions where these investments are being made are very important.
Hrant, Samantha Power said that the U.S. is investigating the quote-unquote exodus of Armenians from Artsakh to determine whether there was ethnic cleansing. What's the end goal of such an investigation, and what outcomes could we expect from this?
Asbed, I can't believe you asked that with a straight face.
Well, that's me, the consummate professional.
Go ahead, Hrant. Do you want to answer that question? Sorry, I had to chime in.
Okay, basically.
Well, to be honest, Hrant, I'm sorry to interrupt. To be honest, I feel like they are going to investigate and find that there was ethnic cleansing, and then I'm sorry for being such a cynical person, then try to use that as leverage over Azerbaijan.
Well, I mean, in what decade? I mean, that's also important. Yes, maybe 10 years from now, or when all of the Artsakhs are all well dispersed
have dissipated
around the world, maybe
and gone to diaspora. Yeah. For me,
I mean,
the goal would be to get them to
to
put 150,000 Armenians back in Artsakh.
Look, I mean, so the question, yeah. Well, look, Asbed, you're now even more professional than before.
Science
if we use that word, science fictiony. Seriously, Asbed, like, I mean, we have all the evidence, right? I mean, it's all. So what evidence are they looking for? This is more than a year's worth of almost a year's worth of time that they have been investigating. They didn't launch this right now. They've been doing that. They've been threatening, or they've been talking about investigating for almost a year. So I just feel it couldn't be more cynical and unfortunately disrespectful than this. But maybe Hrant knows better. You know,
I think you and I are violently agreeing on this. Hrant, your take on this?
Well, basically, if not being emotional, I would rather agree with Asbed, because yes, Americans want to create another negotiating position, and that's how they do. So basically, it will be a leverage on Azerbaijan, but by the way, on Armenia as well, because for Azerbaijan, it will be a mechanism to push or to threaten that they might pass another resolution, or they might somehow punish or somehow demand something and so on. But for Armenia, it will be another kind of thing. So if Armenia, for example, behaves in a manner that Americans would welcome, then they will assist somehow the refugees and so on and so forth. So America will become a bad policeman for Azerbaijan with that and a good policeman for Armenia. But, the problem is that with this kind of investigations, you don't change the thing on the ground, which is important. But yes, there will be some, another negotiating track, which might serve some needs of refugees as well, but not to the extent it might change something for real.
Okay, so now we are coming to the last topic in our discussion, but it's a big one, because last week, MPG, one of the main pollsters in Armenia, released its latest poll results. And there are several eye-catching results, let's just put it that way. Pashinyan's rating apparently increased slightly among the respondents. And apparently, Armenians are yearning to join the EU. A majority of the respondents said that they want to join the EU. Similarly, they said that they want to leave the CSTO and so forth. So we'll cover all of those in detail, but let's begin with the most general and obvious question, which was, is Armenia moving in the right direction? This is slide number 3 in the MPG review. You can look at it in the show notes. And according to this slide, about 26% say that Armenia is moving in the right direction. Meanwhile, about more than 50% are saying that Armenia is moving in the wrong direction, while 20% are saying, they have a difficulty in responding. So how do you assess this general dynamic, and how do you think it has changed from the previous time that they published this specific question?
Well, I had this question like a year ago, and then it was like 36% saying that Armenia is going in right direction and 52 saying it's going in wrong direction. The poll was made in March 2023. Now, in July 2024, 25% think that Armenia is going in right direction, and almost 53% say that it's going in the wrong direction. So basically, a number of those who are considering Armenia's direction as wrong has not changed, but the number of people who considers this direction right direction has decreased. That's what is important. So basically, we see most of people being discouraged by the current policies and the events, but not to the extent which is threatening this government, to be frank. Because, for example, in United States, there is, according to latest YouGov poll, there are 21% who are considering America's direction right, and 71 who consider this direction to be wrong. So in Armenia, it's surprisingly lower than in United States currently.
And I should mention that the error margin on these polls, most of them, is around 3%. Sometimes I've seen 2.5%, and other times I've seen 3.5%. But we should generally, when talking about these polls conducted over the telephone in Armenia, the error margin is usually about 3%, as it was this time. Now let's move to the next question, which I found that according to the credits, Hrant, you have been the contributor to this question in this poll around Artsakh policy. And the question is phrased as, what policy should Armenia pursue in the Artsakh issue? And nearly 10.2% of the people say that we should forget about Artsakh. And 21.5% say we should essentially restore control over Artsakh. And I'm assuming this is the only way to do this would be militarily. There are other answers in between, but how would you assess the responses to this question and compare it with previous, if this question has been asked before?
Well, these both questions were included in this survey by me. I had this opportunity, so I consider these questions as being the most important. So the direction issue and the Artsakh issue. Why Artsakh? It's because lately Artsakh has been gone out of the official discourse of Armenian authorities completely, and they were struggling to wipe it out of the public discourse as well. Not completely successful, but given that Armenia now has more and more territorial issues on its border, even within the Soviet borders, the Artsakh story is getting less importance lately, and people talk less about it. That's why I decided to check what is public discourse about Artsakh issue right now. So basically, we see 10% agreeing with the government policies on that matter. Of course, they were not asked per se whether they agree with government policies or not, because then approach towards the government would affect this option on forgetting about Artsakh positively. So we just wanted to know what is just a general approach of the public. And 10%, I don't think it's much, given especially the fact that now Armenia does not control Artsakh at all, and all Armenian population has left Artsakh, and so on. So the 10% is not much in reality. Of course, it would be better if the percentage would be lower, but that's a reality. Now, majority would seek for either solution that would give Armenians possibility to return back, which would mean relative majority, of course, 1/3 of those surveyed. So basically, this means that there is no direct control of Azerbaijan over Artsakh, and it's a kind of, international governed area. So this is 33%. Another 29.5% would prefer waiting for better times to get back to Artsakh issue, and mainly to address it in a diplomatic manner. Then 21.5% would prefer quick and most probably military solution, or maybe again diplomatic solution, but seek of returning Artsakh territory back. So I think this is just important to understand where the Armenian public opinion stands right now, because of course, even up until September 2023, the public opinion has been completely different. But we understand that now the situation has changed and the government's approach has also changed. So this is a situation where in reality, we can say that just 55% of the population is concerned about Artsakh issue right now. The rest are either ready to forget it completely or to give this issue a time, which means not addressing it today.
Okay, moving on to the next question. This was assessing the appetite for constitutional changes in Armenia. Now, the ruling regime in Armenia has been introducing this agenda of constitutional change in many different ways, or having some kind of a, let's say, referendum, or having some kind of a plebiscite on Armenia's direction in general. There have been, like, for instance, calls to have a referendum on joining the EU, calls from Pashinyan representatives to change the constitution. So it was, I think, a good idea to look at the appetite of people for changes to the constitution. Now, the specific way that this question was phrased, which is slide number 12, it said that President of Azerbaijan, Ilham Aliyev, stated that the most important condition for concluding a peace treaty with Armenia is the amendment of the constitution. And then they proceeded to ask, what do you think? Should the constitution of the Republic of Armenia be amended? And when phrased this way, around 80.3% said no way. The constitution of Armenia should remain unchanged. And I guess only 3.3% said the constitution should change, and about 11.7% said, yes, some things should change, but probably not everything that Aliyev wants. Now, the interesting thing is that they included a comparison with a similar question in January 2024. And I say similar because at that time, when they asked that question, they didn't precede by saying that this was demanded by Aliyev, but said, do you want changes in the constitution? They said Nikol Pashinyan wants to make changes to the constitution. And at that time, the resistance to change was much smaller. So when in January they asked, Pashinyan wants to make this change, more people said, yes, we should allow that to happen. Now, when they proceeded with Aliyev is wanting this change, more people categorically said no. How would you assess this particular question? What should we make of it? Is it positive? Is it negative?
Regarding the constitutional change demanded by Aliyev, yeah, there is a difference in answers. Whereas if phrased as it's Aliyev's demand, then 80% is completely against and just 3% is for. Whereas if you phrase it like it's Pashinyan's demand, then 13% are for the change and 38% are against the change. But basically, what we see from here is that majority is against these changes, despite the fact who is initiating the changes, because majority does not trust the current policy of constitutional change. So that's first thing. Another thing is that there is a question which kind of referendum will be made, and overall which will be a mechanism of constitutional change, because lately Pashinyan was stating that we might change not only the constitution itself, but first we need to change the mechanism of constitutional amendments. So basically he wants to bring it to the parliament where he has a constitutional majority or 2/3 of MPs, which effectively will mean that he might change the constitution every way he might decide. So,
yeah, just by just through the act of the parliament.
Yeah, just through the act of the parliament, and we know that there is virtually no MP in Pashinyan's faction that might go against his will. We had never ever had this kind of case of any Pashinyan's MP voting against his proposed law. So basically, we don't even have a parliament because we have, this stamp machine. But anyway, the issue is that the constitution might be changed even without a referendum. By the way, today there have been publications in Armenian press that, by the way, unconfirmed publications, but anyway, that Mirzoyan has raised the question of the constitution in the negotiations and asked to postpone this issue to the period post-parliamentary elections of 2026. So if it is true, this will mean that the constitutional amendments issue will be raised again 2 years later. But let's see how it will develop. And anyway, Aliyev will push Armenia to hurry it up. But anyway, I think that Pashinyan does not want to make this change right now because it's politically problematic. And
in fact, the Azeri press were talking about the so-called Belfast model, where as part of the peace between England and Ireland, they pre-agreed that the constitution of Ireland would change, but it was not part of it was not a precondition to the agreement. So many analysts are predicting that the so-called framework agreement that they sign, or that they, let's say you're probably even skeptical that would be signed, but if a framework agreement is signed, that might include some kind of an intention for the Armenian side to change the constitution, but the specific pushes for the change would not happen now. Do you agree with that analysis?
Theoretically, this might happen. And theoretically, there might be a framework agreement. There have been many framework agreements on the Karabakh issue as well. For example, the so-called Madrid Principles. And not only that, I mean, they can pre-sign this document. But there will be another threat if Azerbaijan considers Armenian signature to readiness to change the constitution as an excuse for another war, because they most probably will try to set a time frame. And if Armenia will not fulfill, they might attack, demanding a constitutional change. And again, we will see the same behavior by Pashinyan. He will say, what can I do? They attack, we have to concede. Because we have seen such behavior many times.
Agreed. And constitutional changes in Armenia have been pretty difficult. As far as I know, all the previous times that Armenia tried to change the constitution have been problematic. There have been allegations that the turnout has been manipulated, for instance, in previous elections. And I think that the previous governments tried to pair constitutional changes with elections so as to, in order to increase the turnout, so that more people would show up and the quorum would be met for constitutional change. But I think that is now banned by Armenian law. So you cannot have a referendum on the constitution at the same time as an election. So given this, how do you foresee that the Armenian government, even if they wanted to, I mean, it seems like at least verbally, they are saying that they want to, and in order to obey Aliyev's orders, how might they try to approach this in order to have a good turnout for the referendum, for any future referendum?
I don't see any way how they're going to do that. The only possible thing is that they might try to, you remember there was an agenda on referendum on accessing EU. So if they try to put EU accession into Armenian constitution, the same way as Ukraine did, they might try to increase the turnout if EU accession will be a popular demand. But the question is, if there is really high demand on that, I adopt it. Another thing is that as of now, even with that, I'm not sure they are able to pass the constitution. We can remember the Yerevan mayor election like a year ago, which was held in September 2023, where the ruling party has got just 32% of votes. I doubt it's enough to pass the new constitution. That is why Pashinyan is trying to change the way of changing of the constitution. Now, regarding the previous acts of constitutional change and even the very adoption of the first constitution in 1995, based on the figures we have and the data on votes by precincts, we can conclude that there was very big extent of election fraud in the constitutional amendments or adoption referendums in 2015, 2005, 2003, and 1995. The extent of fraud there in all of the above-mentioned cases was as big as we can be more or less sure that none of these constitutions has passed and has been adopted by the population.
In fact, that's a reason that Pashinyan supporters say, we should finally have a constitution that is adopted without any fraud. So just FYI.
Yeah, but I am afraid they will start making election fraud as well.
Well, that's not important. The important is statements.
Yeah, well, every government has said that now the people support our constitution. They might do the same thing, but it will not change the situation. I mean, I doubt people will support this constitution. We have the poll data here as well. So I doubt people will support this constitution, even the new one, and even if they will try to detach it from Aliyev and so on and so forth. But I don't believe people will support the constitutional change. So either government has to make fraud, or they have to change the way of adopting of the constitution, because it will not pass the threshold, which is 25% of all voters and 50+% of those who came to vote. Even this is not possible as of today. So I think if there is a free and fair constitutional referendum, the constitution will not pass. By the way, they wanted to have this kind of referendum in 2020. And even in that time, they have made opinion surveys and understood that the constitutional changes will not pass. So even today's situation is much more difficult. So I don't think they might be a viable referendum, which will let the government to make a justification for constitutional change, especially at the demand of Aliyev.
Yeah, I think that there are two more important questions that I want to ask regarding this poll. Actually, one of them is a combination of three questions. There was a separate question in the poll about whether Armenia should leave the CSTO, become a neutral country, or actually even join NATO. Then there was another question about whether Armenia should join the EU, and another one about Armenia's relationship with the EAEU as a precondition for joining the EU. And across all of them, there seemed to be a huge support. I mean, this is crazy. And perhaps I should have asked Asbed to ask this question, because it's difficult to say this with a straight face. But on the question of joining NATO, about 29% of people said that Armenia should join NATO, which is a 6.5% rise. And only 17% said that Armenia should remain in the CSTO, which is an 11% fall. Now, I understand that there have been various propaganda efforts to change the public opinion, but I could not pinpoint a specific, let's say, instance of propaganda that would cause such a huge or an instance of events that would cause such a huge drop in support for CSTO or EAEU even, because there are, on the question about EU, more than 50% of the people said that Armenia should join the EU. It's like as if EU is waiting for Armenia with open arms. Let's put that aside, but 50% or more of the people believe that Armenia should join the EU. I mean, at this point, I should say, what are they smoking, But Hrant, how do you explain the answers to these questions about the EU, about the EAEU, and CSTO?
Okay, first of all, regarding the NATO poll, anyway, majority, at least the relative majority, wants Armenia to be neutral. 44.3% said Armenian should be neutral. Regarding the NATO popularity, we need to understand that if many opinion leaders say that Russia is a threat to Armenia, many people will start believing them. And yes, in some ways you might consider this opinion, but then, of course, there is another question: to which extent NATO accession is a realistic option. But, people don't go this deep usually. 29% is not as much. Of course, it's still much more than than needs to be, considering that Armenia cannot be part of NATO. But anyway, I think we need to consider that, first of all, that majority still wants Armenia to be neutral country, 44% for neutrality, 29% for NATO, and 17% for CSTO. Now, regarding the EU, 57% would like to join EU, or 56.7% would like to join the EU. But if asked that first Armenia needs to leave the Eurasian Economic Union, then this number drops by 11%. So basically then 46 point something percent of people say Armenia should abandon EU membership to join the EU. Again,
but if you remove the 16.9% who had difficulty responding, I believe that's still a majority of the respondents, if you remove the undecided category, right?
Yeah, that's also true. But first of all, if the question is put on the referendum, then your consideration is legitimate, because then those who are undecided, they will not vote. But if we are just trying to investigate the public opinion, then we understand that those who are undecided, they are not supporting either membership in Eurasian Economic Union or membership in European Union. Of course, there is a big issue of the waiting list in European Union, because in the last 19 years, let's say, just 3 countries accessed European Union: Bulgaria, Romania, and Croatia. And 1 country, but much bigger, Great Britain or UK, has left European Union. So effectively, European Union got even smaller. So it's very doubtful to see European Union expanding fast in foreseeable future. But anyway, some people just want to believe that Armenia can also have this option. And this is important because in March, European Parliament has adopted a resolution where the MPs of European Parliament have voted for a call for European Union agencies to start considering Armenia's membership. Again, it's just a parliament resolution, but still, this has been widely promoted by Armenian media, by the government. There are some new statements by the government, and then the government proposes a referendum for EU accession. So for many, EU accession became a viable option, although it is not in reality, but for many people it is. So it's not an issue of public opinion, it's an issue of politics, in my view.
Okay, so continuing the question, I guess, the eye-raising news in this poll was 2 separate questions. One gauged the popularity of Bagrat Srbazan and his movement, Tavush Hanun Hayreniki, or Tavush for the sake of motherland, slide number 8. Another one asked for Pashinyan's approval rating, slide number 10. And for Bagrat Srbazan's movement, seems there is a huge drop in support. So between May and July, the number of people who completely trust Tavush for the sake of Armenian movement dropped from 35.1% to 18.3%. And the number of people who somewhat trust the movement dropped from 17.8 to 15.5. Altogether, that's about a 20%, I guess, drop in the popularity of the movement. And when they asked a question about Pashinyan's approval, I think that the number of people who completely support Pashinyan increased from 9.1% to 13.4%. And then the number of people who somewhat support Pashinyan increased from 18.7% to 21.7%. So that's about a, I guess, 5-6% rise in Pashinyan's popularity.
Hovik, can I add one bit of news? As of yesterday, I think Pashinyan is on a month-long vacation, which tells me at least that he is not at all worried about this movement. So,
in Berlin, Berlin, right? You know, he published photos of him watching the football game in Berlin and driving his bike in Berlin. Yeah, completely showing that he's confident.
Yeah, first of all, unfortunately, this bike riding propaganda still works. And, this is really disgusting to see. Because even when he came to power in 2018, this was considered as a cheap trick, even by his supporters. And now they are in so loose situation that they have to support this, to promote these videos and so on. Now, regarding the approval rates, it's noteworthy that as of now, 34% generally supports the Tavush movement and 35% trusts Pashinyan. Although these figures are not completely comparable, but it tells something. Basically, it tells that Pashinyan won this round of political battle and he stayed in power. And not only that, he is continuing his policies. So basically, people are supporting the winner, even despite the fact that he won in some instances, which they would not be glad to see. But anyway, people do not want to support losers. They want to support the winners. And Pashinyan is winner in today's situation. And that's why his popularity grew again and now stands at 35% of approval rate. So basically, what I can say is that propaganda works, because from what I know from another polls is that somewhat around 70% were supporting the Srbazan movement or Tavush movement in the very beginning. Then when in the beginning of May, the propaganda started attacking Bagrat personally and the movement politically, for example, connecting it to Russia, which is complete nonsense, but still they did it, and connecting it to Kocharian, which is again nonsense, but still, at least you could find some Kocharian people marching in the movement, but there was completely no connection to Russia. But anyway, they were very effective in assuring some people and many people that this connection has something to do with Russia. So that's why many people who do not support pro-Russian politics or are anti-Russian, they turned their back to Bagrat Srbazan, and that's why his approval rate started decreasing. So as of now, unfortunately, we see that, again, there is a deficit of leadership in Armenia. Even Pashinyan, with his increased approval rate, still stands at rather low approval, but still not as low as it used to be. So basically, I think this shows just how Pashinyan won this round of political battle.
I agree.
All right, enough for the day. Time to ask each of you if there's been something on your mind. Hrant, do you have any thoughts you'd like to share with listeners?
I think that's fair enough.
Hovik, what's on your mind?
Well, I was pressed to find some good news to rant about or to talk about at the end, but unfortunately I'm forced to address the circus that is the Armenian judicial system. And just today, the Supreme Judicial Council reprimanded Judge Ana Danibekyan for her shortcomings in trying Robert Kocharian and others in the infamous case where he was being tried for violating the constitutional order and for corruption. As you know, the violation of constitutional order was deemed as anti-constitutional by the Armenian Constitutional Court. Meanwhile, the corruption case met its statute of limitations, so it expired. It was funny to watch Karen Andreasyan, who, by the way, has been mentioned in the PACE report. Check out our last episode of Spotlight on Silence with Rafael Ishkhanyan, where we talk about where the PAC is saying we should not have politicians who are judges and who are leaders of the Supreme Judicial Council. But essentially, the Supreme Judicial Council led by Garen Andreasyan, reprimanded Anna Danibekyan for failures to try these fast enough. And one of the failures was she didn't separate out the corruption case from the constitutional case, which, if you go one level deeper, is a farce of its own, because the corruption case is based on the testimony of this one apparently entrepreneur woman. No one knows her except a few people, and she is a frequent witness for the government in all these cases where she admits that she has given bribes apparently against all these like former leaders, and she is now the star witness in all these cases, and she's the only witness in most cases. So apparently Danibekyan failed. The only thing that I was surprised I didn't hear Garen Andreasyan say was criticism that she took time off to get a nose job during the trial. Nothing against judges getting nose jobs or any other cosmetic surgery, but truly, that was the level of criticism that was leveled, in my opinion. In any case, I have no pity for Danibekyan. She was a willing servant for the regime, and I hope that this is a good message to all the others who continue to serve this regime. No one is above Pashinyan, and when they are no longer needed, they will be discarded away like used napkins.
All right. Well, let's leave it there for today. Hrant, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Shnakalson Rajan.
Thank you, guys.
That was our show, recorded on July 16, 2024. We've been talking with Hrant Mikaelian, who is a political scientist and multidisciplinary researcher in social sciences based in Yerevan. He is also a senior researcher at the Caucasus Institute. Please remember to support us. Go to our donate page, podcasts.groong.org/donate, and become a sustaining member of Groong and give monthly. Thank you in advance. I'm Asbed Bedrossian.
And this is Hovik Manucharyan.
Please follow us on social media and follow us everywhere you get your Armenian news. The links are in the show notes. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you soon.